Okay, let's get going. We're just going to pick up the fourth Mishnah of the fourth chapter. So we're in the fourth and the fourth. And we're going to deal with arbitrage. You might call it tax avoidance. We're going to deal with getting out around the rules. And we're going to be surprised by the fact that the Mishnah seems to condone getting around the rules, as if it seems to want to make it easy for the Jewish people to fulfill these mitzvot. In a minute, we'll jump into the text. But before we jump into the text, and in order to understand where it's coming from, I just want to repeat some of the principles of Maaser Sheni, which we've covered in the last few weeks, all related to redeeming Maaser Sheni for money. We've already learned that if the distance to Jerusalem is too far, one can redeem the Maaser Sheni, to produce for money, and travel with the money to Jerusalem. And we learned at the end of the third Mishnah in chapter 4, we learned at the end of the last Mishnah that when we redeem one's own Maaser Sheni for money, one has to add a fifth. And this is the Talmudic fifth. So actually, we would say we add a quarter. The total ends up as 5 quarters, of which 1/5 of the total has been added by the owner. And one of the surprising features of halacha is that a non-owner does not need to add the fifth. In other words, you can buy Maaser Sheni, you can exchange Maaser Sheni for money at market prices. Only the owner himself or herself has to add the fifth when they redeem. And of course, this difference between halacha for the owner and the non-owner, the fact that the non-owner does not need to add the fifth, provides an opportunity for arbitrage and for tax avoidance. And we're going to see this play out in much of the rest of the chapter in the next couple of days. I also want to remind you, because we're going to come across these halachot today in the third Mishnah that we look at today, that we learned this at a very early stage, we always use the local market price at the place where we redeem. Yeah, if we transport from A to B and redeem in B, we use the price at B. And I think it's implied, but we'll clarify today, that we always use a time-relevant market price. So we use an up-to-date market price, very similar to the situational valuation, which we looked at the end of last week, where in case of doubt, we would look for 3 bids or 3 offers. We always use a time-relevant market price. And, we might have had a previous contract for sale, and contracts for sale can stand at previous market prices, but the redemption price is always a live market price. So those are the principles. Let's jump into the text now. And just to remind you of the end of the third Mishnah, the third Mishnah ends, Hapodeh Maaser Sheni shelo, someone who redeems his own Maaser Sheni. Mosif alav chamishit, he puts on a fifth. Bein shu shelo vein sheni tan lo b'masma, even if it's his, or even if it was originally his, or whether it was his because it's given to him as a gift. So if you redeem your own Maaser Sheni, you add a fifth. But now, let's jump into the fourth. Let's jump in now to the fourth Mishnah. It's really interesting that the Mishnah begins, Ma'arimin, you can be deceptive. One can be deceptive. Al Maaser Sheni. Arema, aremut is deception. It's an anagram, actually. Aremut is deception. It's a biblical word. The serpent in the Garden of Eden is described as arum. We can be deceptive or tricky in terms of Maaser Sheni. How does it work? You could say to your grown-up son or your daughter, or to your Hebrew slave or manservant. These are all people with agency, with capacity. The Rambam comments here that when we have a Hebrew slave, we only purchase the work of his hands. We don't actually purchase his body. He's like a hired servant. So these examples, the grown-up son, the daughter, the Hebrew slave, the female slave, these are all people with their own capacity. We can say to them, "Helech ma'ot elu uftei lach maaser sheni zeh." Take this money and redeem this Maaser Sheni for yourself. In other words, you give the money to someone you know, and you get them to redeem it. And of course, they're redeeming Maaser Sheni, which is not theirs. So they don't have to pay the fifth. And then the Mishnah continues, Avalo Yomar Ken Livno Levitor. You can't say that to your son or your daughter who are minors, or to your Canaanite slave, because, of course, they essentially are part of your household. And the Mishnah is, if you like, the Mishnah is falling back on the legal definition of a minor as part of your household. It's willfully choosing not to look at the fact that the practical definition of someone of your household really does include someone who's an adult son or adult daughter. But the Mishnah is going to make it easy for the Jewish people to redeem without paying the extra fifth, just by relying on the legal definition only of someone who's really part of your financial estate. And it's going to give a second example. Someone who's standing on the threshing floor and he's got no money in his hands. He can say to his friend, look, I'm going to give you this fruit. So it's not his fruit anymore. It's his friend's fruit. And of course, his friend, if he now redeemed it, would need to pay the extra fifth. But Choser ve'omer, his friend would need to pay the extra fifth. But the original owner doesn't, because it's not his fruit anymore. Choser ve'omer, harei elu mechulalim al ma'ot she'babait. These should be redeemed with the money that's in my house. So he hasn't even brought his money to the threshing floor. It's an off-balance sheet transaction, but he's effectively converted the Maaser Sheni into the money that is sitting in his house. Both of these are legal fictions, and we'll learn a little bit more about these later in the chapter. But in between, the Mishnah is going to do a little discursus about market pricing. Mashach. Someone took possession of Maaser Sheni for a seller. Now, we've learned before that when you take possession, when you form a legal contract for movable objects, you need to move the object. Mashach means to pull, and that's the term used in the Mishnah, and you can think of it as lifting it up. When you lift up the object, the contract is formed, even if you haven't yet paid for it. And we learned looking at it the other way around, by the way, that paying for it without lifting it up doesn't create a contract. It's in law of contract in the Mishnah, the Talmud, the act of picking up the object is the act that creates a contract to purchase movable goods. Land is different, as in English law, actually, land is different, but for movable goods, picking it up creates contract. So we've created a contract. Someone has contracted to buy Maaser Sheni for a seller. He's clearly not paid for it. Before he had time to redeem it, i.e. to pay for it, the market price had gone up to two sellers. What can he do? Well, he gives him one seller. The contract was for one seller. Absolutely. But what's happening? What's the significance? He gives him the one seller. He makes a profit of one seller because the Maaser Sheni is now worth two sellers. Maaser Sheni shelo. So the Maaser Sheni, the profit, he's now actually got two sellers worth of Maaser Sheni, and that's what he has to eat. If he needs to redeem that again or needs to eat it in Jerusalem, he's got to eat two sellers worth of Maaser Sheni. Goes the other way too. Mashach mimenu Maaser b'shtayim. He contracted to buy Maaser Sheni with two sellers. The price and the market price has dropped to one seller. He gives him, now this is where it gets interesting. He can give him a seller of chulin and a seller of Maaser Sheni, because he can, the redemption value, even though he's contracted to pay two sellers for this Maaser Sheni, the redemption value is now only one Maaser Sheni. So from the point of view of the law of contract, he has to pay two, but the redemption price is only one. And that's why he can give him one seller of Maaser Sheni and one seller of chulin. And the recipient, of course, then has to deal with those two types of coins separately. And then the Mishnah concludes, Im haya ha'aretz noten lo mi demai. Well, this is the printed text, and I'm just going to try to refresh it because I changed this source sheet slightly, and the Kaufman has a different reading. Kaufman reads mi damav, from his money. So we have two readings of the Mishnah. We have mi demai. He gives him from demai, in other words, from money which is linked to Maaser Sheni for produce which is dubiously tithed, which might have had Maaser Sheni already taken out of it. Damav is his money. And the Rambam and the Bartanura actually read this Mishnah differently. Clearly, they've got different texts. The Rambam reads it as damai. In other words, that if you're dealing with an Amma Aretz, you wouldn't give him real Maaser Sheni money, because you wouldn't trust him to deal with that properly in its proper way by taking it to Jerusalem and eating it in Jerusalem. So that's the Rambam. The Bartanura actually mentions, and the Bartanura, by the way, follows the Kaufman manuscript. In reading Damav, he should give him out of his money. And Bartanura explains there, that means he should give him out of his chulin money. In other words, you just give him ordinary money, which is not kodesh at all. And look, it's a puzzling close to the Mishnah. We're actually not sure which way around to read it. And both readings seem like they might be rational. The Kaufman, the Rambam is very careful normally about his manuscripts, and he makes sense reading Damai. But Kaufman is the most reliable manuscript we have, and it reads Damav with Bartanura. So I just leave it to your choice. And tomorrow we'll learn more about other kinds of financial arbitrage and deception. But that's all for today. So I'll just close now and take any questions.